Hello and welcome to my breakdown, where I show you how I create urban scenes, structure them, and which add-ons can be helpful. I've shown many things in my last videos, so I won't go into detail everywhere. However, I will explain and demonstrate new things or how I have adapted techniques from the tutorials in practice. First, I will show you some add-ons I like to use. These add-ons are not strictly necessary for everything, and you can use alternatives, of course. If you're not interested in the add-ons, you can skip to the next chapters. There I show you how I structure and build my scenes, along with some tips on shading, geometry nodes, and compositing. Creating animations involves many steps that aren't always fun or can be very repetitive. I don't particularly enjoy modeling, but I love creating shaders and animating. Some things, like the tunnel you will see later, I built myself. However, for other objects or systems, I like to use assets or add-ons. I also include affiliate links in the description, which allow you to support me without any additional costs if you buy the add-ons. The first two add-ons are transportation and launch control. Transportation gives you many car models that you can use directly. Launch control is used to animate the cars. It works not only with cars from the transportation add-on, but with any other car as well. First, I delete the default cube. Then I open my side panel and immediately see the transportation add-on. Now I select, for example, sports cars. Let's take the BMW. Click on import, and then here we have the BMW. To animate it, I need to make it editable. Transportation creates its own rig, but I want to use launch control. So first, I have to delete the rig. Next, we use the launch control add-on. We go to local, then collection, BMW M3, and click rig vehicle. Now the car follows the predefined path. Of course, we can adjust this path by selecting it, going into edit mode, and moving it. The car follows the path. The ground is also recognized because it's in the ground collection. We can change anything, of course, if we want a different path or a different ground. For that, we can simply insert our own path here and click Animate Vehicle, and then the path will change. If we want a different model for the ground, we just have to open the ground collection and the launch control collection and find the object here. Everything in this collection acts as the ground, and the car responds to it. Here we can also activate physics. Because I've activated it in the middle of the animation, on frame 73, the car started to glitch a bit. To make it physically accurate again, we need to go back to the start of the animation and then play it. Now everything works without any problems. The wheels rotate and point in the direction the car is moving. We can adjust this further or use predefined presets. To avoid glitches when scrolling to the animation, we need to bake it. This eliminates any physics-related issues. Launch control also offers effects like headlights or skid marks. Let me show you the headlight effect, for example. For this, we select Cycles and go to Rendered View. First, I delete the lamp here to make it dark. In the drop-down menu, you can activate low beam or high beam lights. We can choose, for example, LED lights and immediately get a beautiful IES profile for the light. The light is, of course, customizable. You can control the light entirely from the menu, and if the lights are positioned incorrectly, you can simply move it or hide them if you don't want them to be visible. There are also many more lights to choose from with different IES profiles. I like using launch control because it offers a simple, fast, and straightforward way to create realistic vehicle behavior and physics. Additionally, effects like the skid marks or lights are very helpful. The next add-on I want to show you is the Urbaniac add-on. It works here in the asset browser. Now we have all kinds of categories to choose assets from, ranging from large structures like buildings to materials for urban scenes. There are also decals for the road. Let me enlarge this view a bit. Here are sidewalk sections, street sections, and much more. I will delete the default cube here as well as the light and then just drag the desired object into the scene. Now I switch to cycles. Of course, it also works with Eevee, but I prefer cycles. I haven't imported an HDRI yet, so I will disable the scene world for now. And this is how the object looks in rendered view. The cool thing about Urbaniac is that we have the scene control on the side, which allows us to control all the assets at the same time. For example, we can activate snow and then control it in scene configuration how much or how little snow we want. This works with other objects as well. If we import another asset, for example, let's take the bus stop, we just need to sync it and we can control the bus stop along with the road. Everything that I adjust here affects the entire scene, including raindrops or water. If we duplicate the road or use an array modifier, it also works seamlessly, with snow connecting perfectly across all objects. The shaders are also customizable, but I think they already look good. If you want to adjust them, you can open the shader editor and make changes. Much of it is sorted into groups, so you can dive in and adjust them as needed. You can completely replace the textures or just tweak them using the sliders in the groups. For example, as shown here, you can adjust the asphalt for a bit. For more customization, you can also open the groups and modify everything inside. The next feature is the building generator from Urbaniac. We have individual buildings that we can drag in normally, but we also have the building generator. Let me use this as an example, and all necessary assets and a basic form will be imported. This works the same way as with other assets. Once you adjust the snow, raindrops or anything else, the shader on the building changes as well. I will rotate the building a bit because I like the other side better. There are also more sliders for the buildings, like controlling how many lights are in the room, but first we need to sync the building with the scene. The scene configuration offers many options to modify the scene. If we don't like the shape of the building, we select it and go into edit mode. Here we select the areas we want to expand and extrude it by 3 meters. To repeat this action, simply press Shift and R. When we switch back to object mode, we see that the building looks different now. It's a bit taller and now has a small terrace at the top. The parts of the building, like the walls, can also be adjusted by selecting them. Depending on the vertex group, different modules for walls and windows are used. To adjust the modules, you need to adjust the vertex groups. We can remove the link to the vertex group. Whether you want to assign it manually or randomly, it's entirely up to you. Urbaniac is definitely one of the add-ons I use a lot to build urban scenes. The next add-on that I want to show you is the city generator. We open it, click here, and voila, a complete city. It's really just one click and we can check out in rendered view how it looks. There's no HDRI, so I will disable scene world. I can start animating right away or make any further adjustments. I will switch back to solid view first because we want to adjust the city a bit. In edit mode, we can select edges and extrude them. That's how easy it is to create new streets, complete with buildings and all the assets. Simply select and adjust the edges. Then we switch back to object mode where we can make more adjustments on the side. For example, we can only display the buildings or just the streets without the buildings. We can make the streets wider or smaller. We can adjust the building space to make the sidewalks wider. We can also change the corner radius in the corners. This menu allows you to quickly and easily customize the city as desired. If we don't like the assets, we can also replace them. If we want to import our own trees, we just need to insert or replace them in the city generator assets collection. This is the trees collection, for example. As soon as we add other trees to this collection, they will automatically be used in the city. In my animation, I use building generator to create the buildings and turned off the buildings from city generator. I also use other assets like benches, lamps and phone booths from the Urbaniac add-on. This works very well because you can simply replace everything in these collections if you want to have a different look. In my animation, I also deactivated the cars and added my own cars. But as a base, it is very helpful because I only need to replace the assets and position the buildings. I like especially the street textures. The add-on provides a mix of different asphalt textures, road damage and road lines right off the box. With just a few clicks, you have this base, which you can customize further. In terms of quality, I think it's good enough even for close-ups. For example, I adjust the curb slightly so it doesn't look as sharp. To do this, I simply added a bevel modifier and adjusted the size and the number of segments. The next and final add-on I want to show you is Procedural Traffic. It's very simple. You just have to click here to import traffic. This is the created ground in the ground collection, similar to the launch control add-on. Here is the curve along the cars will drive. Of course, you can adjust the curve, make it larger or smaller, move it, or simply add your own curve to the collection. It's just important to be on the first frame to update it. Here I can select cars to add to the traffic simulation. The cars are also available as assets outside of the add-on. This means you not only have the traffic add-on, but also getting a lot of cars as assets. For example, I select the Chevy Tahoe and click Add. The cars then drive along the path. If I want to make changes, such as adjusting the number of cars, I can do that here. However, my cursor isn't on the first frame, so it doesn't work. Once I scroll back to the start, it works as intended again. You can also make the cars respond to the objects, such as stopping and braking. I created a cube and added to the stopped collection. I make it a little larger and apply the scale. When I play the animation from the beginning, the cars start braking. If they only brake and don't stop, the object is too small. So I make the cube a little larger, and now the cars stop without colliding. When I remove the cube, the cars continue driving. This can also be animated with keyframes, for example for traffic lights or something. You can change acceleration, speed and other settings by selecting the cars. To adjust the distribution of the cars, you need to select the curve. Here you can adjust the distance between cars, randomize the distances or increase the number of cars. More cars can easily be added here. If you want to display this, select the cars and deactivate Fast Preview. Then click on Real Cars in Viewport, but this slows down the viewport a lot. Now I switch to rendered mode and select cycles instead of Eevee. Here you can adjust the same settings for the cars. You can activate the headlines and change the intensity. To adjust the light more precisely, I activate the Do Not Delete collection and select the light to modify it. Here we can change the color or angle of the lights for all cars. You can also replace the light source with another one. For my animation, I used the lights from the launch control add-on with a more realistic IES profile. As with the city generator, I tweaked and combined the add-ons to achieve different results. You can replace everything here, even the drivers in the cars. There are also settings to customize the look of the cars. Let me turn off the headlights again, and here you can add imperfections or dirt to the cars. The intensity can also be adjusted. I will move closer to the car so you can see it better. Since I don't have an HDRI or lights again, I will disable Scene World here as well. Now you can see the dirt and imperfections, which add more realism and variation. You can adjust the intensity or disable it entirely. I often use this add-on for my animations. The first thing that I always do is prepare the cars, so I don't have to set up the shaders or other details later in the project. I finish everything here, save it in a separate project, and import the cars later. In earlier videos, I have explained how to create paint and tire shaders, so I won't go into detail here. You can check out my tutorial on that. However, I did simplify one thing. I created a group to make everything easier to control. As you can see on the car, I have some imperfections that I can adjust to be more or less visible. I find it too clean without any imperfections, but small imperfections enhances realism in my opinion. Here you can adjust if the paint should reflect more or less, or change the size of the imperfections. I've also shown in earlier tutorials how to create and use groups. This group contains the same nodes as in the car paint tutorial, and the group's output is connected to the clear coat roughness. I've also added imperfections to the tires and other parts using the group. For example, you can see small scratches here. These are minor details, but I think they make a difference. This is how the setup looks in the collection. As mentioned, the setup is explained in the car paint tutorial. We have two imperfection textures here, controlled by a color ramp and combined using a color mix node in lighten mode. Lighten means that everything that is brighter in this texture than in the other will be added. Here is the first texture, here is the second, and this is how they look combined. You can only see the first texture here, and the scratches slowly appear. The scratches are brighter than the white marks and are added more strongly depending on the factor. This is how the imperfections are combined. However, to ensure it's not just imperfections, I used the second color mix node to combine it with the roughness of the car paint. I've connected the roughness value here. This black area at the bottom indicates stronger reflections on the car. The darker the color, the stronger the reflections, and the brighter the color, the higher the roughness value. So I can control this externally without going into the group. This group can be applied to any object without issues to add imperfections easily. Now let me show you how I built the industrial district animation step by step. I started by creating the ground and distributing all the road lines. These road lines came from the industrial pack of the Urbaniac add-on. They are available in the asset browser and I simply add them. You can also find similar textures on the internet or import PNG images as planes. For example, here we have these parking spots. I wanted to place many of them, so I used an array modifier for this. This allows me to quickly determine the number of parking spaces. The lines of the containers are also from the industrial pack and were simply placed. To arrange everything, I use a satellite image from the internet as a reference and rebuild the layout. Next, I worked on the ground shader. Let's take a look in the rendered view. The ground shader includes a bit of variation. There's variation in the brightness as well as in the roughness, but we might not see it well from this angle. I also added some small pebbles and dirt to make it look more realistic. In reality, the ground would have some dirt and debris scattered around. Although the base ground is an asset from Urbaniac, I customized the texture. When we look into the asphalt shader, you will see that I didn't use the Urbaniac texture, but instead created my own shader. This is the asphalt texture. Without the imperfections displayed, you can already see some details, but it wasn't enough for me. That's why I created the shaders and added them. Let me show you how I set it up. Let's start with the asphalt texture. Here we already have a few noise textures, which I use often. First, there's the albedo map, which initially looks very uniform. I wanted to add some variation as seen in reality. That's why I included the noise texture. To control it, I added a color ramp, and the output serves as the factor for the RGB curves node. This means the albedo map goes in, gets brightened a bit, and the result is passed into the next RGB curves node. The factor here, as mentioned, is the noise texture. This makes the texture darker only in certain areas to add more variation. I applied the same principle to the roughness. There's a roughness map here, which I connected to the noise texture to create more reflective areas. Now, if we look at this, we already have a nice asphalt shader. Next, I added the debris and dirt textures. These shaders add a few more small details. You can find such textures for free on the internet. I connected the shaders using a mix shader node and used the alpha map as a factor. I did the same with the dirt shader next to it. This is how the debris shader looks. I have an opacity map here, controlled by a color ramp node. Then I connected it to a noise texture, which reduces the density of the debris in some places so that it doesn't look uniform distributed. The result is then output from the ground and used as a factor for the mix shader. This way I ended up with an asphalt shader that I liked much better. The road lines, as mentioned, came from the Urbaniac add-on. That's why I can also control the wear and tear, for example. Adjusting this value changes how worn the road lines appear. The higher the value, the less visible the road lines are. I used a value of 3, so they only look slightly damaged. If you want to do this yourself, you can connect the texture of your road lines with a color mix node to a noise texture and adjust the alpha channel, similar to the road debris shader. After the ground was finished, I animated the car, but since I've already shown how to do this in other videos, I won't go into detail here. I then began placing the assets, these industrial assets. The background buildings were created with the building generator again. The buildings were then distributed using instance collections. I use instances or instance collections to keep the face amount relatively low. Although the scene has 5 million faces, the buildings make up only 1 million. That's not much considering the many buildings, various assets, and the level of detail. The viewport gets a little bit slower because of this, but you don't always need to see them. For the other assets, I distributed many of them using geometry nodes to keep the phase count low and make adjustments much faster. Geometry nodes also work with instances, which is very powerful. For example, I didn't place every container manually. Instead, I placed one container, then used the geometry node setup to stack the containers. I did the same for the trucks. When I select one truck, multiple are selected because they all belong to the same geometry node system. I used different techniques for this. For the trucks, I distributed them along a line. At each point, a random truck from the collection is added. If I go into edit mode and move one of the points, the trucks also move. Here, first let's lock the z-axis so they stay on the ground. Also set the orientation to global. If we want to add more trucks, I only need to add more points. Either select an edge and subdivide it, or extrude vertices. I find this approach practical because the instances keep the poly count low even for the trucks. I use the same technique for other objects like the forklifts and so on. Let me show you how I set up the geometry nodes to distribute objects like the trucks or the containers. The method works like this. We have two objects here. Both are in the same collection. Here we have our curve along which we want to place the objects. First, we select the curve and create a new geometry node setup. Then we add the resample curve node. This controls how many objects will be placed along the curve. We can set the count directly or specify the distance between the placements. For example, every 1.8 meters. I will set it to count and choose 5. You will notice the curve changes slightly, showing how many points it consists of. The points are indicated by the bands here, and an object will be placed at each point. We do this using an instance on points node. Now we give the information which objects we want to use. For this, we drag the collection into the setup, resulting in a collection info node. Alternatively, you can drag in a single object to get an object info node. However, we want to use the entire collection, so we connect it to the instance socket. Then, activate separate children and reset children to place the objects individually and directly on the curve. Now we can see the objects, but only the cube appears. To randomize the selection, we activate pick instance. This works, but we still need more variation. To bring in more variation, we add a random value node and set it to Boolean. We connect the random value node to the pick instance socket and adjust the probability slider. With the seed value, we can randomize the order. Let's increase the count to make it more visible. Next, I want the objects to rotate along the curve. First, I deactivate the geometry node setup and switch to edit mode to adjust the curve. Here, I will make it a bit longer and rotate on one of the points. When we view the curve from above, we will notice that the objects are all facing the same direction. However, they should rotate along the curve. In the instance on points node, we can rotate all the objects at the same time. However, to adjust them individually, we use an align rotation to vector node and link it to the rotation socket. Nothing happens yet because the align rotation to vector node doesn't have any curve data. For that, we use a curve tangent node and connect its tangent socket to the vector socket. Now the objects rotate along the curve. If we increase the count again, it becomes more visible. Previously, all objects faced the same direction. Now they follow the curve. There is also an option to place objects on the vertices of another mesh instead of along a curve. However, the plane must be in a different collection, of course. We then apply the geometry node setup to it and make a few changes. Let's deactivate the curve for clarity. The resample curve node is no longer needed, so I will deactivate it. Now the objects are placed on the vertices of this plane. You can adjust the object selection here as well. In edit mode, you can move the points and the objects will move too. You can also extrude vertices to add new objects. I used this technique to place the containers. To stack them, I selected everything, duplicated it, and moved it upwards. You can achieve a similar effect by creating a grid in the geometry node editor, but I find this method easier. The containers also have a slight random rotation along the z-axis to ensure they are not all perfectly aligned. We don't want them to rotate along curve, so we delete the curve tangent and align rotation to vector nodes since they are not needed here. Instead, we add a new random value node and set it to vector. We only want to rotate the z-axis, so we leave x and y unchanged. To isolate the z-axis, we use a separate xyz node to only get the z-axis values. Then combine them with a combined xyz node. Connect only the z-axis to the combine node and finally link it to the rotation socket of the instance on points node. Now the objects only rotate along the z-axis. You can set the minimum and maximum rotation values in the random value node. For the containers, I only wanted slight rotations, so I choose a small value. You can also adjust the seed to randomize the rotation further. These simple techniques allow you to quickly distribute objects over large areas. The fence, for example, was placed using a simple array modifier. If I had created individual objects for every fence, container, and so on, the scene would become very heavy. In the collections, I have hidden assets. These are the objects I used for the instances, and here in this folder are the visible instances. For example, if I open the collection with my containers, you will see there are 6 different models. These were then assembled in the container blocks. Each container block is an object of the 6 container models from the hidden collection. I used the same method for the trucks as I showed earlier. Here are the small truck assets, the big truck assets, and so on. These collections serve as sources for the instances. I grouped all of the industrial assets into one collection, making it easier to hide or show objects depending on what I'm working on. Another collection here contains my car-related elements. This includes the car from the animation, launch control, and the tire smoke. While the car drifts around the curve, smoke comes from the tires. For this, I simply added a cylinder, halved it, and parented it to the tires so it follows them. The cylinder acts as an emitter for the smoke and is invisible in the render. Using geoscatter, I distributed a few objects like barrels and wooden pallets on the sides. In this case, I used geoscatter. If you're looking for a method to do this without any add-on, I have a video in my channel covering that. When I activate this, the objects become visible. There are way too many than you would find at a typical container dock, but I like the look. I used the culling masks to prevent objects from being placed on the roadway or inside containers. I also have the camera in their own collection, divided into camera curves, focus, and camera. Camera 0.001 is the camera for the first scene, camera 0.002 for the second, and so on. The curves and empties with the same ending belong to the same camera. I usually duplicate cameras so I don't have to set up the modifiers again. In the graph editor, you can see that I added a few noise modifiers to create a more dynamic scene. I often use multiple modifiers on multiple axes, and it would be too time-consuming to set them up again every time. To vary the camera shakes, I only change the offset value. What's also very practical is that when I duplicate the camera, the curve, and the empty for the focus, I not only get the same camera shake, but the camera also follows the duplicated path and focuses on the duplicated empty. This approach speeds up the process when animating multiple cameras along path rather than creating and linking everything from scratch. Next, let's look at the tunnel scene. The tunnel scene is actually quite simple. Most of the elements I used were already shown in the previous sections. I started with the tunnel. The bevel modifier here is unnecessary and it's deactivated. I just wanted to see how it looks. The important elements are the array and the curve modifiers, which I used to create the tunnel. Here's the tunnel curve along which the tunnel and the road run. I will deactivate the modifiers so you can see the base object. The tunnel consists of just this single module, which I modeled myself. I will quickly hide the other objects as well, including the car and the traffic. Let's take a look at the tunnel in rendered view. This is how the tunnel looks. For the road, I used assets from the Urbaniac add-on again, which is why the ground appears white. Let me reactivate the road. It runs along the same curve as the tunnel. As mentioned, I modeled and textured the tunnel in Blender. Let me deactivate the road again to speed up the viewport. Let's take a closer look at the model. I started with a cube and deleted the 2 opposite faces. Then I beveled the 2 edges at the top and extruded loop cuts on the sides to create the sidewalk. That's all there is to it. The tunnel is very simple. We move through the tunnel so quickly in the animation that it doesn't matter if some areas have sharp edges. The level of detail was enough for my animation. If you're placing objects along a curve, it's important to have enough loop cuts along the object. If there aren't enough, the object might develop sharp edges when using the array and curve modifier. The tunnel has enough geometry to ensure smooth curves. What's also very practical is that you can duplicate the curve, adjust it slightly, and use it to animate the traffic or the main car. To do this, you only need to go into edit mode and move the points as needed. This way, you can quickly create curves for the cars. The road uses the same curve as the tunnel and is in the ground collection for the traffic. If I modify the tunnel curve, the entire structure changes. However, the car and traffic curves would need to be recreated, while the tunnel can be adjusted quickly. From the inside, it's a bit hard to see. Let's look at it from the outside. It's more visible here. There's nothing outside the tunnel because it wouldn't be visible anyways. To prevent the ends of the tunnel from being seen, I created steep curves at the start and the end of the tunnel. Otherwise, I would have to restrict the camera view to avoid showing the tunnel's end. With this setup, you can see the tunnel's exit or entrance, no matter where the camera is pointing. Next is the elevated highway scene. Here I used assets from Urbaniac again, and the road runs along the curve just like in the tunnel. This means that if I move the curve, the road layout changes. For some assets, I created separate curves since they don't follow the exact path of the road. For the ground, I used the shader from my landscape tutorial series. I didn't make changes to it, just imported the same shader. Let me show you how it looks in rendered view. The ground is detailed enough because later trees and buildings will be placed and the animation takes place on the highway. This means the ground isn't seen clearly most of the time. If I didn't already have the shader, I probably would have just used a single texture. I did, however, disable displacement to keep the scene lighter. I placed the highway and assets primarily using curves and geometry nodes to quickly make adjustments, like changing the distance between assets. For example, the lamps here are positioned along a curve, as well as the signs with arrows. I set these up the same way I demonstrated earlier. For highway exits, signs appear at regular distance, and I configured this easily with geometry nodes. There aren't many assets on the highway, just lamps, signs, and some large roadside boards. I placed these manually without geometry nodes since they appear at a very specific location like the highway exits, and it's easier to do it manually. I also manually placed a few trees where they would definitely be visible to the camera. I first distributed everything with geometry nodes and then add specific objects after animating the camera. For example, as I scroll through the timeline, you will see certain objects placed in specific spots so the camera sees them. I also built this bridge above. It also follows a curve, making it easier to adjust. Like in the previous scene, I duplicated the curve for the road, tweaked it slightly, and used it for the traffic. Each lane has its own curve, and I did the same for the main highway below. The curves are organized into different collections for better clarity while working. That's how I animated the traffic, adjusting the lanes slightly so the cars sometimes switch lanes instead of simply following a single one. For the background buildings, I scattered them instead of placing them manually. I first used the building generator to create different buildings. The scattered buildings are only visible during rendering because having them visible in the viewport slows it down by a lot. The environment collection can be turned off to make the buildings more visible. Here are the small buildings in this collection. I also have a few larger buildings to add more variation. Repeating objects or patterns can become very noticeable, especially in wide shots. I scattered the generated buildings across the entire landscape and created a mask underneath the highway to ensure buildings wouldn't be placed there or collide with it. In my scatter tutorial, I explained exactly how this works. In the viewport, I keep the buildings deactivated most of the time to keep it responsive. I don't need to see the buildings anyway because they are only background elements. I just enabled them in the viewport once to check that they weren't touching the highway. In essence, it's just the highway, the ground, a few signs, and buildings. It's relatively simple to create. I think it took me about 3 hours to build the environment, add the cars, and set everything up. Creating the camera setups and animation required additional time. Part of the time was also spent brainstorming the layout but often you get new ideas during the process and make adjustments. For example, the bridge, when I was deciding where to place it and how it should look like. I ended up tweaking its design afterwards. The creative process isn't always straightforward and needs time. Now let's move to the final scene, the city. As I mentioned earlier, I used the city generator to create the ground and use it as a starting point. This means I used the city generator system and customized it with my own assets and shaders. I only had to replace the assets in the collections, for example in the street assets collection. I simply added my own objects and they were automatically placed along the street. I used the assets from the Urbaniac add-on because I like them a lot. The collections are deactivated, so the individual objects aren't visible, but they show up in the city generator. In these collections, I added assets like electrical boxes, trash cans and other street elements. The street lamps, benches and phone booths also came from the Urbaniac add-on. I only slightly adjusted the ground shader and added a bevel modifier to round off the curb. However, the bevel is disabled in the viewport since it's not needed there. That's the basic setup. Later, I placed additional buildings. I created the buildings with the building generator as in the previous scene, then converted them into instances and distributed them along the streets. I didn't use the buildings from the city generator, although they look very good. These buildings are quite resource heavy, so they're deactivated. That's another advantage of collections. Simply hiding them isn't enough, as they are still processed in the background. To make the viewport more responsive, you can fully deactivate the objects and then enable them again later for rendering. To fully deactivate them, just click this box here. This way the viewport becomes smoother. Next, I imported the cars for the animation and added the traffic. The traffic is divided into parked cars along the streets and moving cars on the road. This can be easily done with the traffic add-on. Since the street is just a straight path, setting it up was very quick. For the traffic, I created a straight Bezier curve, duplicated it, then I changed it a bit for the main cars to prevent collisions. For example, here one car overtakes another, ensuring that cars don't drive through each other. The setup is again organized in collections. I have my city generator assets and the buildings. In the assets to save collection, I included objects I created or customized in this scene that I might want to use for future projects. These objects can be easily imported into another project and saved as assets in the asset browser. This way I don't have to recreate them for the next projects and can simply insert my shaders, groups and objects as needed. To avoid searching for them at the end, I saved them directly in a collection and deactivate it. Here's my car stuff collection, here's the traffic, the camera setup and the ground with pedestrians. I was able to build the city quickly and easily, just like the other scenes. Finally, let me show you my rendering and compositing settings. I usually keep the sample rate at around 300. Depending on the scene, fewer samples might not be enough for darker scenes and you need more. I set the light path to 5, except for transparency, which is set to 8. If you have many transparent shaders, such as tree leaves, you can increase this value. Otherwise, 5 is usually enough, as it reduces light bounces and speeds up the rendering. However, for large scenes like these, the Simplify option is very useful. With many objects, faces and shaders, the graphics memory usage becomes very high. Simplify helps to reduce this. For rendering, I set the texture limit to 2048. A higher resolution like 4K or even 8K isn't necessary for this animation. Higher resolution consume more graphics memory and increase render time. However, this also limits the HDRI resolution to 2048 pixels, which is too low. The HDRI is a 360-degree image, which is visible over the entire sky. A higher resolution is needed to avoid it appearing blurry. To solve this, I enabled the transparent options on the film, so the sky won't be rendered. The sky will be rendered separately and later combined with the foreground. This is easily done in the compositing window and works automatically once everything is set up. For this, I created a linked copy of the scene and named it Sky. In this scene, I deactivated all objects, so only the sky would be visible. To display the sky, you need to disable the transparent option again. To ensure the sky is rendered at full resolution, I adjusted the simplify settings by either disabling it completely or setting the texture size limit to no limit. Now the sky is rendered in full resolution. In the Compositing tab, I combined the two scenes. Let me explain the compositing setup. In the Compositing tab, I combined the two scenes. Let me show you how the group works. First, the render layers. Here's the render layer with the sky, which you can select below. And underneath is the render layer with the foreground. For the foreground, I need many passes. The image, the alpha information, an emission pass, denoising data, and Z. To get these additional passes, you need to activate denoising data first, and then under light and other enable emission. The emission data is used to create masks. For example, I wanted to apply a glare node to the image, but with a different intensity for objects using an emission shader. This way I can control the intensity independently. Often the effect is too strong on the lights and too weak on the non-glowing objects. Here I've created the basic export group, which I use for almost every project and adjust it if necessary. At the top, the sky image is the input, followed by the foreground rendering, the alpha channel as a mask, and finally the emission and denoising data. Inside the group it looks like this. The sky and foreground are connected using a mix node. I use the alpha information from the foreground rendering as the factor. Since the sky is black in the alpha mask, I can easily distinguish between the sky and the foreground in the compositor and use the information as a factor. With this, the two layers are already combined, and I now have a high-resolution sky along with the foreground rendered with lower resolution textures. However, the image is not yet denoised. So far, it looks like this. Without the mix node, the foreground looks like this. Let me also show you the alpha information. You will see that the foreground is white and the sky is black. This is what I used as the factor for the mix node, where the foreground is simply placed over the background. The result of the mix node is then passed into the denoising node to remove the noise from the entire image. In the background you can see how the image looks so far, with the noise removed. The output from the denoising node is then passed to a mix color node above it. This mix color node masks out the emission objects, so the lights are completely black. You will notice these small spots where the lights are located. This happens because I used the emission pass as a mask for the mix node. Everything with an emission shader is removed, so the glare effect doesn't apply to them. Otherwise, the glare effect would be far too strong on the headlights in this case. You can now see the effect applied everywhere, except for the small glowing dots in the headlights. If you look closely, you will see a black spot here. This isn't meant to stay black. It will be added back in. First I took the emission pass and blurred it slightly, just 1 pixel, so there wouldn't be a thin black outline around the lights. The result from this blur node was then connected to a glare node to apply the effect to the emissions, but with a much lower intensity compared to the node above. I don't need the glare effect to be that strong because the glowing areas are naturally brighter than the rest of the image. Here's how this effect from the glare node looks alone. In the node above, it's the opposite. Everything except the emission objects are affected. With this add mix node, I combined the two results. Here you will see that the lights reappear and they are no longer black. With this setup, I can control the intensity of the glare node independently if needed. Finally, I added some mist or fog using the map range node. The from max value controls how far the fog effect extends, and I can adjust this externally from this group. The color ramp is used to tweak the intensity. Darker colors on the right side of the gradient reduces the maximum fog density. The result is then combined using the mix node. The bottom image of this mix node is the fog color, which I can also adjust externally from the group. Here's how the group looks from the outside. Groups in the compositing window works just like in other windows. If you have watched my tutorial on groups, you will know exactly how to create something like this. These are my rendering settings in Blender, with 2 separate scenes for the sky and 1 for the foreground, the simplify option and my basic export group. I follow this workflow for almost every project. That was my breakdown of how I created the 4 scenes. I kept my explanation short to avoid making the video too long. If you have further questions, feel free to leave a comment. I hope you learned something new and see you next time.